Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you, to see so many people gathered again, and not be simply virtual as we were last year. It really makes me filled with wonder and awe to see you all here, and to see you here for this wonderful discussion that we're about to have on the Pax Americana. I'd like to welcome all of you, not only in the room, but those who are also participating online. My name is Paolo Carozza. I'm the professor of law and director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. This particular panel is also being sponsored by Loyola University, so I'd like to express my thanks to them for their support. I have two exceptional guests here to introduce to you and to engage in conversation with about this important topic today. To my left is Andrew Bacevich, who importantly grew up in Indiana. I think maybe that's the most important thing. We'll just stop there. Andrew graduated then from West Point and Princeton. He served in the Army, became a distinguished scholar and teacher, and is now a writer and the president and co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a Washington, D.C. think tank. He's the author or co-author editor of more than a dozen books. The most recent one is entitled After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. To his left is my longtime Notre Dame colleague and friend, Michael Desch, who's the Pax Professor of International Relations at the University of Notre Dame and the director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. Before arriving at Notre Dame, Michael was the founding director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs and the first holder of the Robert Gates Chair in Intelligence and National Security Decision-Making at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He's published numerous scholarly works, many articles, also addressing a broader audience, not only an academic one. So, gentlemen, undoubtedly, the one question that is on everybody's mind, because it's what's in front of us in the newspapers and urgent, is, are we going to be facing a war as soon as today in the Ukraine, and what is the U.S.'s role? But before we get there, I thought maybe it'd be useful to work our way up to that, because it doesn't come out of nowhere. This whole panel was sort of conceived last summer when we first started talking about it in some way to engage the questions and the provocations that came to us, in particular witnessing the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the collapse of Afghanistan, and the particular way that the U.S. and President Biden responded to that. And many of us asked ourselves, wow, does this mark the end of a historic era of the U.S.'s involvement in the world? It certainly seemed, as a result of that it's now better, more accurate maybe to regard the U.S., maybe we should have long before, as a declining power in the world and not as the unipolar hegemon of the world after the end of the Cold War. So is that right? I mean, should we regard now the U.S. as a declining power? And if so, by what criteria? How do we understand that to be the case? And what are the implications of that? And if it is declining, how should it decline? Is it possible for the U.S. to be a declining power in a way that is, let's say, graceful and constructive for the world? Mike, do you want to begin?
Yeah. Paolo, I think it's accurate to say the United States is declining relative to the really unprecedented and exceptional position it had between 1989 and 1993. But I would resist framing it that way. I think the better way, at least to my way of thinking, is we ought to think about America becoming a normal power again. When you say decline, it both, sort of indicates, something that's really terrible and something that we should be fighting against. I think, there is certainly a downside to the end of Pax Americana, but I also think there are some upsides. But in any case, the unipolar moment that we've lived through, over the past 30 years or so was always destined to end. It was artificial, and the world we're moving into now is the world of normal great power politics, in my judgment. I don't know what you think on that score, Andy.
I think I would disagree with Mike in this sense, that the notion of a unipolar order, the claim that the United States was the indispensable nation, the claim that history had reached some kind of an end, that was always a delusion. The basis of the delusion was the conviction that with the end of the Cold War, the United States found itself in a position of unchallenged ideological and military supremacy, and that supremacy was destined to last forever. Again, my view would be that was always wrong, but those expectations did become the basis of U.S. policy from the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall through 9/11. Arguably up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that's when I think the evidence began to accumulate, showing us that the post-Cold War expectations were always fundamentally misguided and wrong. Now, in some respects, I think the question of the present moment, a question for our political leaders, our political elites, is, have you fellas and gals come to terms with that reality? Have you come to accept that, whether we call it decline or to call it something else? Have you come to accept the reality, which you described, that no, this is not a unipolar world, this is a multipolar world, in which the United States is going to have to learn to live like a normal nation? And I think the answer to that question is we can't tell yet.
I agree with you, by the way, on the delusional elements of the unipolar moment, and I think I picked that up very early on in many things that you wrote at that time. But what's interesting to me is why we were taken in by that delusion. It seems to me that it's undeniable that we were in a pretty good position militarily, politically, economically, etc., at the end of the Cold War. But why we believed that that situation would persist, for a long time into the future, is, for me, one of the big open questions.
Because I am the senior citizen among the three of us, I can answer your question. And the answer, I think, has to do with, particularly for members of my generation and maybe for the generation older, that there was an expectation that the Cold War was going to last forever. There was an expectation that this rivalry between East and West, between liberalism and Marxist-Leninism, was destined to go on forever. It defined international reality. And then, lo and behold, it ended without a shot being fired, without the CIA even seeing it coming. And I think that the shock caused people who otherwise would have known better to lose touch with reality. And so we ended up getting all this end of history gibberish. Now, hard on the heels, remember the Berlin Wall falls in the fall of '89. Hard on the heels of that event, within a year, Saddam Hussein invades and occupies Kuwait, leading then to Operation Desert Storm, which is falsely interpreted as one of the world's greatest military victories. So we have both the ideological triumphalism of the actual end of the Cold War, now combined with military triumphalism. It was a relatively small third-rate war against a fifth-rate opponent, but nonetheless, it seemed like an enormous victory. And I think it's those two things that combine, particularly in members of my generation for a time, to persuade people that a new era had somehow dawned.
We'd reached the end of history.
Right.
We were the indispensable nation. Boy, those were
great
heady
book titles.
times.
But exactly on this point, though, and that's really helpful segue, Andy, to another set of questions that I would love to sort of have your reflections on. So much of the reality of the U.S. being the unipolar power in the world hasn't been, I shouldn't speak entirely in the past tense in this, isn't just vested in the raw fact of military might. It's invested with a sort of moral aura to it. It's invested with an ideology that says we're the indispensable power not merely to maintain order, but to maintain a good order, an order that is directed towards democracy, to the protection of rights, to a rules-based international order in which greater prosperity will be gained by all the peoples of the world. Is that also just sort of an illusion of that time, or is there something left to that? Is it still the case, has it ever been the case in this time, that the U.S. has a distinctive moral role to play in the power that it wields in the world, even in this changing era?
Well, we've always believed, we collectively, have always believed we had a distinct moral role. You go back to 1630 and the city upon a hill, laying a claim to a collective responsibility that we own as Americans, they weren't quite Americans then, that we're called upon to fulfill with respect to the rest of the world. One of the really intriguing things to me, and this tends to center on the meaning of the word freedom. And we are the freedom people. We manifest freedom. We spread freedom. We defend freedom. And to me, one of the most interesting things is, oh, by the way, we also constantly redefine freedom. And our definition, we believe, is the authoritative definition at any particular time. And again, speaking as the senior citizen among us, the operative meaning of the word freedom is a heck of a lot different today than it was in 1947 when I was born. And in some respects, the definition today is an improvement. Sadly, in some respects, I think it's gone in the wrong direction. We've lost sight of what the true meaning of freedom ought to be. Regardless, we manifest freedom, and it's up to the rest of the world to get on board. That tends to be, I think, a continuing theme in our politics.
I think your question is spot on, Paolo, in emphasizing that the unipolar moment was much more than just U.S. Military and economic superiority. That there was an important moral component to it. Or, we felt that the end of the Cold War, not only was we won the race, but we won the race because we're better, because we're a democracy, because we had market economies, we respected sovereignty and human rights, unless we didn't, but we didn't, sort of really talk about it. But the thing for me that I keep coming back to is one of the things that makes us great as a country is this element of morality that's an important part of our national culture. But I see it as a double-edged sword because it also can blind us to some of our own failings and our own weaknesses. And so the triumphalism at the end of history, not only, as Andy suggested, led us to think that we'd be in the catbird seat for 1,000 years. But it also led us to think that the rest of the world would want us there, even our democratic allies. And so we had this, sort of cognitive disconnect when Madeleine Albright, was haranguing the Europeans about us being the indispensable nation. We sort of said, it's just those Frenchies who, never liked us anyhow. Or when Rumsfeld was, dismissing old Europe for criticizing the United States, for the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, we assumed that there couldn't be anything legitimate there because we were in the right. We were on the right side of history. Our motives were pure. We were doing good things. The laws, the iron laws of international politics, especially balance of power, just did not apply to us. And it was even in a way worse. There's a lot of discussion, and I know I'm maybe running a little bit ahead to Ukraine, which you were saving for the end. But for me, the original sin of the period of Pax Americana, or one of them, was NATO expansion. And the evidence, it seems to me, is very clear, and it's from historians, Andrew, so I'm not just bringing political science into this, that in the waning days of the Berlin Wall, that the last Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, had been assured that if Germany was reunified, East Germany could be part of NATO, but NATO would not expand. And yeah, it was never written down anywhere, but the track record is pretty clear on that. And throughout the 1990s, particularly during the first presidency in Russia of Boris Yeltsin, Russian liberals were telling us that if we cared about the fate of Russian democracy, we would not expand NATO. And we sort of said, yeah, but we didn't believe it. We didn't believe it because we thought, how could the Russians regard the expansion of a democratic defensive alliance in which people were coming in as a result of their free choice as a threat to Russian security? It didn't compute. But the truth of the matter is, and we'll come to this in greater detail, is in fact many Russians, not just the kleptocrat in the Kremlin now, but many Russians of otherwise good democratic credentials felt that NATO expansion was a threat to Russian security. And again, we couldn't see that. We couldn't see it because I think we were so convinced that we were on the side of the angels in doing this, that if they objected to it, they had to have evil or malign intent.
See, it's interesting, the example that you use, Mike, because it's not just that we have good intents, but the example that you draw also suggests a presumption of unity with Europe around that perhaps is this longer result of the Cold War that you're referring to, Andy, as well, right? For decades, it was the Atlantic Alliance was seen. Yes, there were some problems over the deployment of missiles in the 80s or something else, but generally that was seen as a unified Western bloc, right? And unified around certain values as well. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Part of what seems to be both the consequences as well as the drivers of the shifting US role in the world is a more explicit fragmentation of what was considered the West and its values and its politics. Is that right? Is that the right way of thinking about it? And if so, what's behind that and how should we understand it? The relations with Europe.
Well, I write about this in my most recent book, at least slightly, and that is, I think it's time for us to ask the question, does the West exist? It was, in its time, it was a useful formulation. And I think, especially during the Cold War, it was useful to think of the United States as part of the West, as the leader of the West. I don't think it makes sense anymore. I mean, we are all witnessing a massive cultural upheaval within our country that is bringing about a vast redistribution of power, of status among different groups. And it seems to me that I don't want to get on sensitive cultural turf here, but during the Cold War, also during World War II, not insignificantly, there was a presumption of white preeminence. The West was a white construct. Doesn't mean there weren't people of color in France or in Great Britain, or certainly not in the United States, but as a mechanism to exercise power, to pursue interests, it was a white enterprise. I don't think that works anymore. Not only does it not work, it's also not in the interests of the United States to view itself and the international order through that lens. And so to me, it is past time for us to rethink the relevance of that construct.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Paolo, that the fig leaf of the West, which I think was always a bit of a fig leaf going back certainly to de Gaulle, but even before that, the debates about German rearmament indicated just how fragile the notion of the West is. But certainly today, it's a less and less useful concept. I'm not sure I'm with Andy on the social piece of it, but certainly in terms of geopolitical interests, the United States has decided, at least since the Obama administration, and probably before, that the locus of great power politics is going to be the Pacific, not the Atlantic world. But also, what you're seeing in Europe today in terms of the very disparate responses of European countries to the Ukraine crisis is again a reflection of very different interests. It's no accident, comrade, that Germany is heavily dependent on Russian natural gas, and that they would have a different view on how to deal with Russia than some other countries might have, makes perfect sense. So in a way, when I think this goes back to a question that Andy had touched on about whether the people today in the administration are recognizing the new world. I mean, I thought President Obama did a courageous thing in moving ahead with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and following through on the agreement that President Trump had negotiated. So I mean, I give him a lot of credit for that, especially because he took a lot of heat for things I don't think he could have really done anything about. But what worries me about the Biden administration is that in many other areas, and particularly in Europe, they think that the way to deal with the Trump interregnum is just to go back to the good old days of Atlanticism. So America is back, we've got your back, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, it was a little bit pathetic. That's how we were seeing the challenges of the 21st century, was simply to repudiate the Trump approach, which probably deserves repudiation in some respects, but not everything that the Trump administration represented in terms of America's role in the world is necessarily wrong, even if a lot of it was implemented in a pretty ill thought out and ham-handed way. And so the West is no more. Why it's no more, academics like Professor Bacevich and I can debate over sherry in the faculty club, but it's gone. He's right. We agree.
So one follow-up question to that, and then I can't resist sort of going to the Ukraine question. But that is, if the West is gone or was always just a construct that was artificial, tailored to the circumstances, then who today are the U.S.'s natural allies? I mean, we've always thought of that's the Europeans, it's the other democracies, it's the transatlantic alliance and so forth. Are there countries, are there regions that we should, or maybe not, regard as being essential partners of the United States in a more nuanced way of thinking about the way that world order has evolved?
So, dating back to World War II, but especially dating back to the beginning of the Cold War, when that first Cold War generation, George Marshall, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, you could name 2 or 3 or 4 others, formulated a new national security paradigm that they viewed as relevant to the new post-war era. That paradigm was based on the conviction that the principal threats to the safety and well-being of the American people were way out there. They were far away. They were in Europe. They were in East Asia. And the appropriate response to those threats was military power. Therefore, it was incumbent upon the United States, really in response to NSC 68, 1950, to build up great military power held in readiness to go fight way out there. The U.S. Army units that are at Fort Hood, Texas, are not there to defend Texas. They're there to go fight, potentially, in Poland. And that was the national security paradigm that prevailed throughout the Cold War and into the post-Cold War era. That's irrelevant, I think. From my perspective, the threats to our well-being and our security are where we live. I mean, what should we be concerned with when it comes to national security? We should be concerned with climate change. We should be concerned with pandemics. We should be concerned with porous borders. We should be concerned with a democracy that is suffering from a profound internal crisis. So the national security challenges that we face, this is not an argument to ignore China. It's not an argument to ignore Russia or the Persian Gulf, but the primary national security challenges that we face are right here where we live. And that says that there needs to be an enormous shift in priorities so that climate change and pandemics and borders get far more attention, and then perhaps we devote fewer resources to being prepared to go defend Taiwan or Poland. I think that's the core issue that virtually nobody within the foreign policy establishment is willing to acknowledge, because their entire mindset is one that says it's threats way out there that we have to prepare ourselves to address. I think that's obsolete thinking, and quite frankly, it's dangerous thinking, because it allows the things that threaten us where we live to go inadequately addressed.
Yeah, I think Andy's right, and I think the threat environment we face, as he laid out, is much more complex. But I think I was hearing a point in your question, Paolo, about who are our key allies today. And I think a lot of people, and this, I think was part and parcel of why the Biden administration was so hard over in revitalizing NATO. It's the old thinking that Andy's describing. But I don't think a downgrading of NATO and a downgrading of the U.S. military commitment in Eurasia indicates that Europe doesn't remain an important partner for the United States. It does economically, it does diplomatically, it does culturally. Likewise, there are other states around the world that we are developing important connections with. India, for example, in South Asia, or Australia. So in addition to our traditional allies in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. And so I think that many people wrongly say anybody, like me or like Andy, who says the United States should be less militarily involved in the world is somehow an isolationist. I think that's canard, and it's also inaccurate. We're internationalists. We just believe that the United States has lots of other tools in the toolbox of statecraft than it can use. And climate change is a key example. There's no way climate change is going to be addressed except as a global issue. It's nothing we or any other country can do unilaterally to address climate change.
But I didn't answer your question. But the countries that are most important, Mexico and Canada. Those are the two nations on the planet where we should indeed have special relationships. One of the things that I never get over is our collective fascination with the British royal family. Why do we care about Harry and Meghan and Charles and Camilla? Why?
And Prince Andrew, did you say?
Why is that appropriate for the nightly news? But I think that is an example of the way in which the old paradigm, where the threats to our well-being were far away, made the United Kingdom, and it was for a time, made the United Kingdom an especially important player, doesn't pay attention anymore. And we should know who is the Prime Minister of Canada, even if probably half of us don't.
So the most pernicious manifestation of this Anglophilia is this dumb bust of Winston Churchill, which is either in the Oval Office or for the brief Trump interregnum in a box in the basement. We ought to take this thing, and if it's metal, we ought to sell it for scrap and spend the money on some of the domestic problems, fix the potholes on Andy's Street up there in Walpole.
Okay, so let's finally then put some of these more general things to the test in the specific case of Ukraine. I mean, one of the questions is pressing on all of us, I'm sure, is simply the descriptive or predictive question of what's actually going to happen and what is going on. And I'd love to have your informed views about how you think it's going to play out over the next few days and weeks. But more importantly than that, I'd like us to sort of get at the question of what does it mean for the United States, for these things more at a broader level that you've been addressing already. What does the Ukraine conflict signify for the role that the U.S. ought to be playing, can constructively be playing? What does it mean to be still a global power, an internationalist, not simply withdrawing, but in a different way, right? How does Ukraine present an example of how the U.S. might engage the world in a more constructive way in this new dispensation?
Well, I fear what it's going to do is that it's basically going to hijack the foreign policy debate. Will persuade elites that we're back in 1947, and that the number one threat we need to worry about is, again, way out there in Europe. Of course, in the present moment, combined with the other way out there threat, which is the People's Republic of China. And that will then become a rationale for the continued militarization of U.S. policy, for continuing to emphasize armed intervention to solve things way out there, and therefore will be an impediment to the sort of large-scale rethinking of U.S. policy that at least I think is very much in order. So whether or not there is a war, and you know, we should all pray that there will not be a war, I think the implications of this crisis are likely to be quite negative.
The Ukraine crisis, but I also think, you know, the sort of potential crisis of Taiwan in East Asia illustrate for me the deep moral complexities of the issues at stake. Ukraine is a weak democracy, but there's no doubt that the sort of democratic tendency in Ukraine is towards the West. And also the Ukrainian assertions of sovereignty are in accord with international law. I mean, you know this better than I do. And likewise in Taiwan, as Taiwan has become more democratic, the sentiment towards independence has grown as well. The problem is in both cases, these trends are pushing us to confrontation with nuclear-armed great powers. And so the tension between what's in our interest and what's in the interest of keeping the peace and other moral values that we hold quite deeply is becoming more and more acute. And this is a world in which we need people who don't think in black and white, but who think in shades of gray, because, you know, the moral elements of these complex problems are not irrelevant. But on the other hand, just saying we have the moral high ground, that we're supporting Democrats in Kyiv and in Taipei against autocrats in Beijing or in Moscow, is a dangerous, you know, sort of mindset to have going forward. So I said America needs to be a normal nation. And we weren't a normal nation during the period of Pax Americana. And part of the thing that a normal nation has to do is to make prudential judgments about competing moral concerns. And we haven't had to do that, but we have to, or for a long time, but we have to do it now. And I sort of, when you think of how the political debates on these issues are conducted, especially in our country, you have to despair a little bit. I mean, where's the Castlereagh or Metternich thinking about, you know, how to rebuild the European order that was destroyed by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars? Where are the statesmen and women of that sort of sophistication? They aren't in Washington, and I'm not sure they're in Brussels or other capitals in the Western world.
Certainly the capacity to, as you put it, Mike, to make prudential judgments about complicated and to some extent irreconcilable moral questions isn't merely a problem of our foreign policy. It's a problem of our political life and our public life and the very use of reason that we have in the world as it is today, where some moral qualities are hung onto as absolutes and swung as ideological clubs, while others are ignored altogether. And a prudence is the last thing that one sees at many levels. So that brings me to a question instead about how do you see, and you began to allude to this when you described the problem of our democracy at home, but how do you see the difficulty of our public life in the United States as contributing to this difficulty of finding a prudent and positive role for the United States to play elsewhere in the world as well?
Well, that's a huge question.
That's
You
why
can
they
pass it on to me.
That's why they pay me the big bucks for being here.
My own view is that I'm a Vietnam veteran, so everything I think and everything I say has to somehow relate to the Vietnam War. And I believe that in many respects, our country is still really wrestling with the undigested consequences of the Vietnam War. And one important example has to do with the definition of citizenship and the extent to which citizenship involves not only rights and privileges, but also duties and obligations. One of those core duties and obligations, in my judgment, has to do with the obligation of citizens to rise to the defense of the country when the country is in need of being defended. I'll give you a 30-second simplified overview of U.S. military history. And that is that the preferred American military system was centered on the concept of a citizen soldier. And when the nation was at threat, or when the nation was going to embark upon some wild imperial adventure, it turned to citizen soldiers to handle that task. That was true in the War of 1812, the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, citizen soldiers. Sometimes relying on volunteers, sometimes conscription. In the Vietnam War destroys the concept of a citizen soldier. We, the people, decide that. The antidote is the so-called all-volunteer force, which the founders of our republic would have called a standing army. This seemed to be a way to let us as citizens off the hook. No more obligation to defend the country, while simultaneously providing a mechanism for the state, meaning the central state, to raise up and organize the forces that would enable us to continue to be the world's leading power. That's what the all-volunteer force seemed to do until itself began to fail, and it failed critically in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which we lost, both of them. So here we are, presumably the world's most powerful country. God knows we spend more on our military than anybody, far and away, and yet we lose. I think that is a fundamental crisis that we confront as a country, and more specifically as citizens. And what we're called upon to do is to think more deeply about what kind of military system is appropriate for a liberal democracy that also finds itself as a great power. And virtually nobody wants to take on that question, because the answer could well involve sacrifice. And that's one thing that the American people are allergic to.
If I could just add one other bad development in addition to the shift from conscription to the all-volunteer force. It's also been the case that Congress is pretty much hors de combat in terms of the war powers. We don't declare war anymore. And, part of the growth of the imperial presidency during the Cold War, reflected some of the exigencies of life in the modern nuclear age. But the real core of the problem is that it's not in the interest of most members of Congress to make hard decisions in terms of war and peace in national security. You don't get elected, for the most part, on those issues, but you can get hurt, especially if you don't support X weapon system, and it turns out to be really critical, or even more important, that it could have been built in your district. And so the idea that Congress would be a check on the executive and also a venue for public deliberation about the larger interests at stake in various uses of force has pretty much gone the way of the dodo bird. So we have Andy's description of the warfare state, which has been a continuous theme in a lot of his work, I think is undeniable. But the thing is that the roots of that problem are also quite deep. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like pogo. We've seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. I don't want to serve. I never served in uniform. I don't want my kids to serve. I'm not calling my 2 senators or my congresswoman every day and lobbying her on Ukraine or other international security issues. And I'm not atypical of the American public. So our troubles are deeply rooted.
Let's see if we can, to some extent, shift direction, or at least shift geographic area, but still push a little bit harder on this question of the U.S. being a responsible international power, a gracefully declining power, perhaps, a more wise power with regard to what are its existential interests, but ask those questions with respect to our relations to China. China, in the view of so many across the political spectrum right now in the United States, does represent, even more than Russia, the single most global threat to American ideals, to American economic interests, to American values, to American relations with others. And to some extent, some of the dangers that are represented in China are undeniable, whether it's industrial espionage or genocide going on against the Uyghurs or wholesale suppression of freedom of religion. Is it then right for the U.S. foreign policy establishment to be, as in some quarters it seems to be the case, increasingly regarding the standoff with China to be acquiring something like a new Cold War status of the superpowers who globally and across fundamental issues of political values are confronting one another? And if that's not the right model, what is? What's the more responsible model that does represent a U.S. engaged in the world in a positive way, but not being sort of recklessly overextended to saying everything in the world is our responsibility?
See, I think China presents another end of history sort of overreach moment, because there was for a period of at least 20 years a great optimism that was widely shared within the political establishment that the rise of China could be managed by the integration of China into the liberal global order, meaning free markets and rules-based international politics. That vision has failed, and I'm with John Mearsheimer. I think it was always destined to fail, as he lays out in his book, The Great Illusion. But I think we're in danger of swinging in the other direction. We had these unrealistic expectations that China's rise would somehow be different from normal great power politics. We were wrong about that, but we're going to say now we've got to treat China as an implacable and invincible adversary. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. China poses challenges, both militarily but also economic and diplomatic. But I have to say, if I had a choice to play China's hand and our hand in the poker game of 21st century great power politics, I still like our hand. And I think, again, the challenge for us is to figure out what we need to stand firm on and what we need to compromise on. And what worries me particularly about Taiwan, which everybody regards as the most likely flashpoint, is we've gone from a position of realistic ambiguity that I think accurately represents the ambiguity of Taiwan's position to increasingly a position of moral certitude, that we have to do everything it takes to defend Taiwan and contain China. And again, I'm not sure we can do it, and I'm not sure we need to do it in order to advance our interests.
So I'm anything but a China hand. I worry about this kind of lazy notion of new Cold War, which implicitly compares the People's Republic of the 21st century to the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire post-World War II. The Soviet Union had vast ideological ambitions. That's one of the reasons why we were, and their ambitions had a certain amount of appeal in parts of Western Europe, in the Third World. That's one of the reasons we had to worry about them. I don't see that the People's Republic has any particular ideological ambitions. They're not trying to convert Africa into a collection of Maoist states. So they're different from the Soviet Union, and we should recognize those differences. Seems to me the competition is primarily in the realm of economics, which kind of says we need to get off our tails and get to work and compete. The comparison with the Cold War might yield some use if we remember the extent to which that even during the Cold War, we and the Soviets found ways to make common cause on certain specific issues that we both cared about, the most significant of those beginning, I guess in the mid-1960s, being nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons. I think the comparison today, I wouldn't want to forget about nuclear weapons, but I think the comparison today, you've alluded to this, is the climate crisis. There ain't no solution unless the United States and the People's Republic of China can collaborate. That's been said 1,000 times. It's easy to say, hard to do it, but I think paying due attention to that issue doesn't make the other issues go away, but could perhaps open an avenue toward reducing the level of tension in other matters as well.
I do think that there is one area of sort of ideological competition that is at stake between us and China, and that's what's the most successful developmental model. And I think China has bet the farm on the Asian model, which is not just particular to China, and we retain much greater faith in the market than they do. I guess I'm a residual liberal, so
But I mean, could the difference be described? Their model is a production model. Our model is a consumption model.
Yes, well, that's part of it, but I think the big part of it, the most fundamental difference, is states versus markets as the adjudicators of economic decisions. And I'm, like I said, I think I'm bullish enough on our system to think that with all its problems, it's a lot better than, an effort to recreate Gosplan or, these great elements of economic dynamism of the communist past. But I think Andy's basic point is a really important one, and I do want to put a fine point on it. Great power politics is about competition, but it's also about cooperation. And for most of history, great powers were able to recognize both of those as legitimate, and in a way to balance one with the other. And I think if I thought that our political class was thinking about China or Russia, for that matter, in both of those terms, I'd be sleeping a lot better at night than I am now, because I don't think that most Americans think that way or see these relationships that way.
So that's, we only have a few minutes left. You've opened up so much for us to think about and to continue to discuss. But given the time, I want to take Mike's very last point and refer to sort of the ordinary citizens and what we're thinking about. I mean, as far as I know, nobody in the room here is exercising major responsibility over the foreign policy decisions of the Biden administration. And it's intriguing to me that so much of what you've mentioned in the conversation, and indeed this new Quincy Institute, a couple years old, that you founded and are directing, is entitled Responsible Statecraft. Responsible statecraft, and much of what you've been talking about are essential virtues like prudence, right? So maybe we could close just, with we have 3 minutes left. I mean, how can we, as citizens of this country, help to develop the virtues that are necessary for responsible statecraft to take place?
Well, I think we begin with coming to a realistic understanding of our own history. A lot of that going on these days. The 1619 Project, as an example. I don't fully subscribe to the claims of the 1619 Project, but I think that proponents of the 1619 Project capture the imperative of being willing to revise our understanding of our own history, to come to some more honest accounting, deeper appreciation. I think that that's required not simply with regard to race. I think it's required with regard to our role in the world. There is this prevailing paradigm: American isolationism, American global leadership. Pick one. It's nonsense. The United States has never practiced isolationism. I think the abiding theme of U.S. foreign policy, going back to the founding of the Republic, has basically been opportunistic expansionism. When there's an opportunity for us to enhance our power, we grab it. Let's take Mexico. Let's take the Philippines. Whatever. And that is how we came to become the dominant nation on the planet by 1945. Opportunistic expansionism doesn't work anymore. There's a need both to recognize the existence of that tradition, the importance of that tradition, and now the urgency of moving to something that is more relevant to the world as it exists and to our place in the world.
Thanks. Mike, last
Andy
words.
Edited, I think, and wrote the introduction to, was it the Modern American Library edition of Reinhold Niebuhr?
It was a University of Chicago Press, but yeah.
And I think we have the intellectual resources within our tradition to think in the realistic fashion that the 21st century requires of us. And I think we also, especially in Niebuhr, have the resources to combine realism with a Christian ethics and to understand that the world we live in is a world of grays, not black and whites, and that the moral choice is going to be made in the gray areas. We Catholics know that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. I would say, if I was going to design the epitaph for the gravestone of Pax Americana, I would say the road to hell the past 30 years has been paved with many good intentions, also some bad ones.
Thank you. Well, hopefully these reflections can help bring us all back to what in the Catholic intellectual tradition has always been referred to as the tranquility of order, right? Which has a very clear moral realism to it. Before thanking our guests, just one quick announcement for everybody at the close of this. Your gift makes the encounter available free for everybody. So please give generously at the donation table outside the auditorium, or you can do so with just a couple clicks from the website at newyorkencounter.org/donate, and those donations are tax deductible. So please join me in thanking Professor Michael Desch, Andrew Bacevich, for such an illuminating discussion today.
Good job. Well done. Well done, Mike.
Well done, Andy.